pessoal. Queria dar boa tarde a todos. Sejam todos bem-vindos. Aqui é a FGV. Em nome do Núcleo de Direito, Economia e Governança, queria dizer que é um prazer tê-los todos aqui. A ideia do evento de hoje que é organizado junto com o Instituto Compliance para celebrar o primeiro aniversário do Instituto Compliance no Brasil, é justamente se dedicar a esse tema tão central e importante no momento que o Brasil vive hoje. O Núcleo de Direito, Economia e Governança, aqui da GV, tem por objetivo não somente trabalhar temas de direito e economia do ponto de vista estritamente acadêmico, mas também organizar fóruns de debate com o mercado e com as instituições governamentais. Então, para a gente é um grande prazer ter esse tipo de evento. Nós temos o grande privilégio hoje de contar não só com os mais diversos expoentes do mercado e também do Ministério Público, mas também com a presença internacional do professor Jeffrey Miller, da New York University. Eu vou pedir licença para vocês para fazer uma introdução a ele em inglês, já que a palestra dele será em inglês também. So, Professor Miller, it's a great pleasure and honor to have you here. Professor Miller has too long a CV for me to summarize, but I'll just give you the highlights, okay? So he's the Steuven Comfort Professor of New York University School of Law. He's been a very well-known academic for quite a long time, but more recently, Professor Miller, and that is a well-known fact, has become Mr. Compliance in the United States. So he's the chief reporter of the principles of the law, compliance effort, and risk management of corporations, nonprofits, and other organizations of the American Law Institute, and this is a very big deal. He's also the author of the book, The Law of Governance, Risk Management and Compliance, and we are so privileged to have him here because compliance, as we all know, is a theme of growing importance in the practice of law and related areas. But academia, surprisingly, in this area has been a little bit slow to catch up, and Professor Miller really stands out in this regard of devoting academic attention, also inspired by his rich practical experience in thinking about this area and the challenges it raises. So for us, it's really a great pleasure to open this event and hear some of the wisdom from Professor Miller. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Mariana, and thanks to FGV for the invitation. It's a great, can you hear me? It's a really great honor to be here. It's a privilege, and it's wonderful to see so many people interested in compliance in Brazil and also around the world as well. So that's my slides. I also want, before starting, to express my congratulations to the Brazilian Compliance Institute. I understand this is the first anniversary of its founding. I think this is a very important event. And also I want to express appreciation, which I share with many, many other people, to the courageous prosecutors, judges, regulators, and others who today are making Brazil a shining light in the fight against official corruption. So the world is grateful to what's happening in Brazil. Mariana mentioned some of my background, and I don't usually discuss my background, but given that this is a new topic, I thought I might mention a few things. I've been interested in compliance for a long time, although I haven't really done anything until recently. And the reason is that law professors study law, and we study books, but books aren't law. Books are words on paper. They're just pieces of paper with ink on them. What law really is what people do in response to legal institutions. And what people do in response to legal institutions today is very often conditioned by the compliance function, because millions and millions of people work at complex institutions that have compliance operations. And the compliance operation has the function of taking the law on the books and translating it into a set of workable rules of thumb that people who are not lawyers can understand, can comply with, and their compliance can be monitored and observed by others. And this actually is often a different set of rules than the rules that are on the books. So the compliance function is a very important part of law, but until very recently, it has been completely unstudied. It's been a black box. So part of my interest in compliance is theoretical and academic, to try to open up the black box and see how the law works in action in this particular and very important part of human activity. My background also includes being the chair of the audit committee of a mid-sized bank in the United States. The experience there is what led me to be interested in compliance very specifically and to get to write about it and teach it, because I became a member of the audit committee of this bank just as the financial crisis was hitting. The audit committee meetings started out being 2-hour meetings 4 times a year. Then they were 4-hour meetings 4 times a year. Then there were 8-hour meetings 4 times a year. Then there were 12-hour meetings extending over 2 days 4 times a year. Then they included interim meetings at other times. So the work of the audit committee expanded dramatically, and this was because the regulators had greatly increased their expectations and their demands in the compliance area. So it was obvious that this bank, which was is a perfectly compliant, normal bank with no problems, if the work of the compliance activities in this bank had expanded so much, it was obvious that the same thing was happening elsewhere. And indeed it is. Okay, so my talk is on a topic I call Compliance 2.0. And so let me get into this. The thesis of the talk is that the second decade of the 21st century has experienced a really remarkable shift in the relationship between regulators and the firms that they supervise. So responding to the perception that misconduct at complex organizations, including corporations, banks, and other firms, had reached unacceptable levels, regulators have massively increased their expectations and have backed those expectations with spectacular fines and punishments. And in response, banks and other firms have greatly upgraded their systems of internal controls designed to deter, detect, and prevent violations of law. And these changes are so profound, in my view, as to represent nearly a revolution in how business is conducted at regulated firms. A change so important that many, I didn't invent this term, but many have taken to calling this development Compliance 2.0. So my remarks today are going to describe and critically assess Compliance 2.0. And I should say that Brazil, although I don't know the details of Brazil's anti-corruption law, my understanding from what I read of the law is that it's a perfect example of Compliance 2.0. That is, this law and the implementing decree of March of this year fulfills the promise and expectations of Compliance 2.0 in a very accurate way. Okay, so to understand the importance and magnitude of these changes in the United States, but also as an example of changes around the world, it's useful to review some of the enforcement actions that have punctuated the headlines of the newspapers in the past few years. So I'm going to start with just a description. Financial institutions. So here's a partial list of settlement agreements with financial institutions over the past few years. In 2012, 5 U.S. banks agreed to pay $25 billion to settle charges they had engaged in abusive mortgage practices. In 2013, J.P. Morgan Chase agreed to pay $13 billion to settle charges it had misrepresented the quality of mortgage-backed securities. In 2012, HSBC agreed to pay $1.9 billion for money laundering violations. In 2015, Credit Suisse agreed to pay $2.6 billion for tax fraud involvement with U.S. tax authorities, and UBS paid $780 million for similar charges. In 2015, BNP Paribas agreed to pay $8.9 billion and was sentenced to 5 years of probation for violating sanctions regulations. In 2014 and 2015, 5 of the world's largest banks agreed to pay $9 billion US to regulators growing out of manipulation of foreign exchange markets. Beginning in 2012 and continuing to the present, several of the world's largest banks have agreed to pay, so far, fines of approximately $5 billion US to settle charges that they manipulated the LIBOR interest rate. So these and many, many others are just spectacular fines that really catch the attention of the public and also senior management at these institutions and affect their bottom line in a very material way. But it's not just banks. So pharmaceutical companies, drug companies, have been heavily sanctioned for marketing pharmaceutical products for uses that are not approved by the regulators. 2013, GlaxoSmithKline, $3 billion. 2009, Pfizer, $2.3 billion. 2013, Johnson & Johnson, $2.2 billion. 2012, Abbott Labs, $1.5 billion. And it's not just pharmaceutical companies. Public health and safety violations. You may have heard of the ignition switch scandal at the U.S. auto company General Motors. General Motors recently agreed to pay $900 million in fines for not disclosing the defect, which caused a number of deaths, and it will undoubtedly have to pay more. In 2015, British Petroleum agreed to pay fines of $20 billion in connection with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. In addition, it's going to spend about $28 billion in cleanup costs and civil settlements. The total cost of the Deepwater Horizon spill to British Petroleum, $48 billion. The biggest cost of all will probably be the Volkswagen emission control cheat scandal, where Volkswagen found a way to avoid complying with emission controls for its diesel automobiles. The estimates of the cost to Volkswagen, all things considered, range from $30 billion to $80 billion US dollars. It's not only this, there's also corrupt practices. So many foreign corrupt practices, in this case, many companies have been caught up in enforcement actions over bribes and other corrupt practices. A leading but far from the only source of liability is the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Major settlements under this statute: Siemens, $800 million in 2008, Alstom, $772 million in 2014, Halliburton, $579 million in 2009, BAE, $400 million in 2010. And today, moreover, allegations of bribery in other countries trigger enforcement actions not only in the U.S. under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but in the United Kingdom under the Bribery Act and under the corrupt practices law of the country where the corrupt practice allegedly occurred. So a company that has engaged in this activity is likely to face enforcement proceedings by at least 3 and maybe more different countries. And these are obviously only examples of the largest fines. There are many others. But so far, I've only been discussing fines, monetary penalties. There are many other bad consequences from regulatory violations. So these I call collateral consequences. The first is legal and professional fees. If you're a lawyer, of course, you like this because you make money, but companies don't really like it very much. Huge legal fees associated with enforcement proceedings. The consumer products company Avon has been paying up to $100 million a year simply to pay for an outside investigation into its foreign corrupt practices problems. It's paid $340 million US to attorneys so far, and the bill is still rising. But beyond that, loss of reputation. When a company is found to have engaged in serious compliance violations, it hurts its reputation with the public. The great example of this today is Volkswagen, which formerly had a wonderful reputation for being one of the best managed, cleanest companies in the world. After the emissions cheat scandal, its reputation is badly damaged. Not only that, debarment. So if you're found guilty of various compliance violations, a company can be prohibited from bidding for or obtaining lucrative contracts with governments or international organizations. This can be very devastating to the business. Criminal liability, not only individuals but organizations are in the US found criminally liable for compliance violations by prosecutors and judges. Civil liability, which can be enormous, many, many billions of dollars of civil liability in class actions and other lawsuits. And, whoops, did I have that? Also, it's not up here on a slide, but important within companies is the fact that CEOs, chief executive officers of companies, often suffer pay cuts or even loss of their jobs when companies are found to have committed serious compliance or violations. So these collateral consequences are also extremely important. Now, I've mentioned so far business organizations, but compliance problems occur at any complex organization, whether or not it's organized for profit. So athletics, huge scandals, as you know, in athletics, doping scandals in international bicycling, U.S. Major League Baseball, and now the Russian national athletic teams. The ongoing scandal at FIFA, the World Soccer Organization. Last week, 16 more people were indicted, several from Brazil. And other athletic scandals as well in the U.S. college football and other athletic activities. Religious and civic institutions, the sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church, sexual abuse by the U.S. Boy Scouts, fundraising abuse by the U.S. Red Cross and other charitable organizations. Governments, multiple charges of official corruption against officials in China, the Petrobras scandal here in Brazil, and many other parts of the world. So when you put all of this together, you can see that this is an enormous development, one with really world consequences, and one which is not going to fade away anytime soon. So we're in a new world, a world which we were not in even 5 years ago. So that gets me to Compliance 2.0. And 2.0 suggests there was an earlier iteration, an earlier version of compliance, and that's Compliance 1.0. And this is the way compliance used to be at American firms, at least. So in that world of compliance, you had a rule-based and paper-intensive approach. So the compliance officer was responsible for making sure that the people in the business lines filled out the right forms in the right way and filed them at the right time, and that the file was complete. Compliance 1.0 was carried out by, I'll put down to low status, by people of relatively low status. They weren't people working on the floor of the factory. They were trained and educated, but their status was much lower than the traders or brokers or other people that they were supervising. And compliance jobs were kind of places you ended up. You had very little options to go elsewhere in Compliance 1.0. Compliance 1.0 was not risk adjusted in the sense that the compliance officer simply went in and did their job and didn't take account of how likely it was that there would be a violation in the places where they were looking. And Compliance 1.0 was distributed, and by that I mean that the different business lines or departments each had their own compliance activities, and there was very little centralized organization of compliance. Now, Compliance 2.0 changes virtually every aspect of Compliance 1.0. There still are elements of this old pattern we can observe in compliance today, but the current trend of compliance and the trend I see in Brazil's corruption law is a very different approach. So Compliance 2.0, first, enhanced authority for internal control officers. The internal audit department in Compliance 1.0 was simply an auditor who looked for audit records. Audit today has been greatly elevated in its responsibility and its status. And it's no longer a check-the-box approach. Instead, it has a great deal of scope for originality and imagination. Internal audit officers, especially the head of internal audit, enjoy good salaries, and they also have the status of C-suite, which means chief something, chief audit executive, and the associated rights to participate in senior management levels, and also in many cases report rights to the board of directors, reporting directly to, for example, the audit committee of a board of directors. Internal audit today in some companies is allowed to participate in the strategic management of the company. They participate in making basic decisions about where the organization should go. This is very different than in the past. What about compliance? Well, again, compliance today tends to be much better compensated, much more status, much more authority, and with significant independence from the business lines. A compliance officer today is expected to represent a credible challenge to the business officials that they are supervising. They also have the status of C-suite, Chief Compliance Officer, and often they report directly to the board of directors. Risk management. So risk management is a new activity in many companies. In the United States, virtually all banks have risk committees of their board, but only about 20% of industrial firms have risk committees. But risk management today is a significant activity. The chief risk officer is an important official who again enjoys status and reporting rights to the board in many cases. We are witnessing today the maturation of one profession and the birth of two others. Internal audit has been a profession for maybe 20 years, but today it's becoming a well-established profession, like law or accountancy or appraising or other things we recognize as a profession. Internal audit is today a profession. Compliance and risk management are very rapidly becoming professions with their own internal organization, as we've seen in Brazil over the past year, and standards for accreditation, and all the other attributes of a profession, including standards of ethics that apply to the profession. So these are very significant developments. Another part of Compliance 2.0, involvement of the board, chief executive officer, and senior managers. So it's expected that the board of directors will give significant time and attention to compliance issues. And it's also expected that the board of directors will act in such a way as to publicly display their commitment to compliance in a way that employees and people outside the firm can observe. The Chief Executive Officer is, in a way, the principal compliance officer at any company. The CEO is expected in her or his professional lives to behave in a compliant way, but also to communicate a commitment to compliance to everyone in the organization. Senior managers also are expected to behave in a compliant way, and many companies have policies of zero tolerance for intentional compliance violations. If you're a senior officer and you violate some rule or norm, and you do so intentionally, you get fired. The CEO and senior management attention to compliance is sometimes referred to by the term tone at the top. And the idea there is that these senior officials should, by their conduct and by their activities and by their communications, create a tone, a feeling, a sense that imbues, that pervades the organization and that communicates a commitment to compliance throughout the organization. Now, next attribute of Compliance 2.0 is that it is risk-based. Everyone involved in the compliance process conducts a risk assessment. They look and see where is the risk greatest that there will be a violation, and if there is a violation, what is the magnitude of the violation? What is the cost of the violation? How serious will it be? Taking into account risk and magnitude, the officials create a heat map, which is simply a combination of risk and magnitude, and compliance resources are focused on the areas of greatest risk and greatest magnitude. And this is true for internal audit, for compliance, obviously for risk management, but it's also true for external audit, and it's true for the regulators. All of these entities and institutions engage in a risk assessment before they go about conducting their activities. So this is a very important part of Compliance 2.0. Compliance 2.0 is enterprise-wide. What this means is that although responsibility for a compliance can be distributed, and in some cases must be distributed in companies that have worldwide operations. You can't not have a compliance officer at your facility in Nigeria, but there's a central organization and central planning of compliance that applies to the entire enterprise. Without that, the enterprise will not be able to identify fully the risks that it faces or to control those risks in a sensible fashion. Compliance 2.0 is data-driven. In the old days, compliance took the form of manual, that is, individuals looking at pieces of paper. Today, the compliance function is very heavily computerized and uses algorithms written by professionals designed to identify red flags where compliance violations may have occurred. Often, the programs are supplied to companies by outside vendors who are expert in this kind of activity. Particularly important in data-driven compliance is foreign corrupt practices, insider trading in securities markets, marketing of drugs for improper purposes, money laundering, and sanctions violations. All of these areas of compliance are heavily data-intensive today. But every aspect of compliance is increasingly data-driven. Compliance 2.0 focuses on individual responsibility. The old compliance, it would often be the case that the company would experience a fine or sanction, but the people involved would not, maybe they'd be fired or lose pay or be demoted, but they wouldn't be punished by the government. This is not true anymore in the United States, at least, and elsewhere in the world, increasingly, it's not true. In the US, the prosecutors and the civil enforcement authorities routinely assume that if there is a compliance violation, they are going to sanction not only the organization, but also the individuals within the organization who caused the violation to occur. And this is not only civil sanctions in the form of fines, but it also means prosecution for criminal violations and prison terms. So Compliance 2.0 is principles-based. This means that it's intuitive, that it operates on, with the right brain as well as the left brain, and the activities of the compliance department look to see whether, in general, according to principle, things are going the way they should be, and doesn't simply look at rules and ask whether rules are being followed. I mentioned criminal enforcement. Compliance 2.0 in the United States and elsewhere is increasingly a criminal activity as well as civil. And this is true increasingly around the world. The United Kingdom recently reached the first deferred prosecution agreement with a company under its Bribery Act. A deferred prosecution agreement is a criminal enforcement agreement in which the government says, if you do what I want you to do, I will not bring criminal charges. But if you don't, I will bring criminal charges. And the activities that are required include things like paying large fines, creating or upgrading compliance departments, agreeing to the appointment of a monitor to make sure that the agreement is complied with, and other activities. I don't know how this is hard for some of you to read, but I will say it. Focus on behavioral and cultural factors. Compliance 2.0 looks at the institution as a cultural phenomenon, and it looks at the compliance activity as a way of affecting people's behavior. So things like behavioral economics, behavioral psychology, anthropology get applied in a real context to try to affect the culture of the organization. This is, if it works, is a very great idea. The reason is that culture affects your sense of identity. I'm a law professor. I feel that's part of my identity to be a law professor. I live in a culture of a law school and academic world. As someone who conceives of myself as a law professor, there are things I won't do, not because my dean tells me I can't do them, but because those are not things that law professors do. It's part of my identity not to do those things. And that's a very cheap and inexpensive way of enforcing norms, to have people simply not do bad things because it's not in their nature to do them. So if culture works well, you simply get people to self-enforce because it will be inconsistent with their professional or job-based identity to do the things that they're not supposed to do. I'm almost done. Compliance today Compliance 2.0 is heavily regulated, and there are many government activities that are involved in compliance enforcement. So several U.S. laws require that firms subject to the laws create compliance programs and state conditions or attributes that these programs have to have. Other U.S. laws don't require the creation of a compliance program, but they make it highly advisable to create a compliance program. My understanding of Brazil's Clean Companies law is the latter. That is, it makes it highly advisable to have a compliance program in place. Why? Well, in the United States, if you have a compliance program in place, and if it's considered to be effective, then the regulator is less likely to bring charges in the first place, and is likely, if it does bring charges, to administer a lesser fine or sentence. So the creation of an effective compliance program both reduces the probability you will be sanctioned and reduces the extent of the sanction if you are sanctioned. And this is a very important and significant reason why compliance programs are now in place in virtually every large American corporation. This, I think, is the last, that compliance programs rely heavily on internal reporting and whistleblowing. Internal reporting means reporting up the ladder within your organization. Whistleblowing means going to the government and telling the government what happened, or of your suspicion of what happened. Compliance programs inside companies always contain internal reporting provisions, at least in the United States. So, for example, there will be tip lines where you can call. There will be mailboxes where you can leave letters. There will be open door policies where an employee can come and talk to the chief compliance officer, the chief executive officer, even the head of the audit committee. Open lines of communication so that people within the company who have knowledge of misconduct can report it up and can do so with a reasonable assurance that their identities will not be revealed so that they do not suffer retaliation by others within the organization for having reported up. As to whistleblowing, many U.S. programs today provide whistleblowing opportunities. If you blow the whistle and it leads to an enforcement action that generates genuine results, you're often entitled to a reward. And the rewards can be substantial. The most famous whistleblowing reward in the United States was earned by a gentleman named Bradley Birkenfeld. Has anyone heard the name Bradley Birkenfeld? So Bradley Birkenfeld was an employee of the Swiss bank UBS. And while at UBS, he helped UBS cheat the American government out of hundreds of millions of tax dollars. He then went to the American government and told what had happened. He was prosecuted and sentenced to prison for 40 months, but when he got out of prison, he received a check for $104 million for having blown the whistle on Swiss bank tax cheating. Okay, so I now come to the final part of this talk, an evaluation. Compliance 2.0, in my opinion, is good. It represents a genuine advance over Compliance 1.0, and it's very important to have upgraded and effective compliance programs in place. But we need to be cautious. We should not be complacent, and we should not assume that the new compliance is a cure-all or will stop all violations. It will not. Violations will continue to occur under Compliance 2.0 as they did before, but we hope fewer and less severe violations. These are some of the challenges. Compliance 2.0 is very expensive. It's costing billions and billions of dollars. JP Morgan Chase announced in 2014 that it was hiring 3,000 new compliance officers. And you can imagine what 3,000 salaries and benefits cost. And that's just JP Morgan Chase. The cost of Compliance 2.0 is very large. And we do need to ask, is that cost justified in terms of the benefit? Maybe there are ways to achieve the benefits of Compliance 2.0 at lower cost. And of course, these costs become worse once a compliance violation has been discovered, because at that point, the organization will probably need to hire a law firm to conduct an outside investigation. When you've hired a law firm to conduct an outside investigation, you lose all control over cost. The law firm can submit whatever bill it wants, and you have to pay it, because if you don't pay it, you will be accused of covering up the violation. So Compliance 2.0, very expensive. We should look for ways to achieve the same benefits, but if possible, reduce the cost. Compliance can be faked. It is very easy to look and find examples of world-class compliance programs that were simply covers for fraud. And the perfect example of this is the Enron company, which had a world-class compliance program, which had a board of directors composed of excellent, high-quality, independent people, which had rights of reporting and internal whistleblowing and internal reporting. It had an audit committee. It had a compliance policy. It was a great big fraud. It was easy to create the pretense of compliance without the reality. And in fact, when one sees a company that, as Shakespeare says, that protests too much, that announces its compliance program in such a grandiose, large way, it almost creates suspicion that they are trying to cover something up by having such a very prominent compliance program. That's not always the case, hopefully often not, usually not the case, but there are examples of fake compliance programs that are very hard to distinguish from real ones. Migration to the shadows. So because compliance is expensive and also compliance imposes limits on what people in the business can do, it creates an incentive to simply take the business elsewhere. Take the business to some unregulated activity where there is not the same expense and inhibitions on activities. And this is happening significantly. Activities are moving to the shadows, especially in finance, where banks have become less willing to provide financing to borrowers that they think create risks. For example, payday lenders who make loans to workers week by week. There are a lot of compliance problems there, and banks have stopped funding payday lenders. Where will the payday lenders get their funding? From someone else who is not as regulated as banks. And that's not necessarily a good thing. Risk assessments. I mentioned this in a talk yesterday, and some of you, I think, were there, but the compliance is based on risk. That's good. We should focus our compliance resources on the areas that create the greatest likelihood of violations and where the violations are most costly. But what if our risk assessment is wrong? If our risk assessment is wrong, then we're better off never having made the risk assessment in the first place. The example I like to give on this is 2006. If you had asked bank regulators or banks, what is the likelihood that the entire world economy will collapse into a catastrophic liquidity crisis within 2 years, 100% of the people would have said very low. Well, there were a few who were saying that was likely to happen, but 99.9% of the people asked that question would have thought it was impossible that the financial world would collapse in a liquidity crisis, but it did collapse in a liquidity crisis in 2008. The risk assessment was wrong. If risk assessments are wrong in compliance, then we could be putting our attention into the wrong topics and allowing violations to occur in other areas. Another concern is that Compliance 2.0 can discourage innovation. Now, it doesn't have to, but it has this risk. Innovation is central to a vibrant economy. And if you have to follow all kinds of requirements and procedures, and if new things are viewed with suspicion because they might create compliance problems, that's going to discourage innovation, and we don't want that to happen. The last of these, and this is where our, next to last, authority on the government. So the great increase in authority by regulators in the United States, they can do almost anything they want. That's good as long as they're honest and fair and don't engage in improper acts. But by empowering the government this strongly, we do create the risk of abuse. This has been charged. For example, in China and in Russia, there have been claims that enforcement proceedings are being used by the incumbent authorities to punish political rivals. If you have a political rival, it's very convenient to accuse them of some crime and put them in prison. In the United States, this has happened as well. There is an American politician named Rick Perry. He was the governor of Texas. Rick Perry was indicted, that is, accused of a crime, by a Democratic prosecutor, Rick Perry being a Republican, and the Democratic prosecutor said he had abused his office. The Republicans responded that the Democratic prosecutor was abusing his office because he was trying to get rid of a political rival. So there is worry that the great increases in authority on the part of the government can lead to abuses. That has to be stopped. And finally, we go to the last one, business cycle risk. In my opinion, the biggest risk of compliance violations is not greed, it's not a lack of internal controls, it is the business cycle. The American financier Warren Buffett, who I'm sure you've heard of, was famous for remarking that it was only when the tide goes out that you see who's swimming naked. When the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked, and what he meant was, when the downtime comes, when the recession hits, then frauds and other misconduct come to light that were not evident in the good times. And one can expand that comment by saying that it's only when the tide is coming in that people begin to remove their bathing suits. That is, when the times are good is when it's possible to get away with misconduct because all kinds of bad actions can be disguised when the tide is rising all the ships. So that the business cycle has a very important consequence for compliance. But Compliance 2.0 does not take account of the business cycle. It applies all the time, in good times and in bad. We might think about taking account of the business cycle and also trying to find ways to mitigate the incentives that good times create for people to engage in bad acts. acts that only come to light when the good times end and the bad times set in. Well, that is the end of my prepared remarks. I want to thank you all so much for listening, and to apologize that I don't speak very much Portuguese, and to assure you that if I tried to speak Portuguese, you would be running out of the room very quickly. So I am sorry if my remarks were hard to understand, but I do appreciate your attention. Thank you.